Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Paula, and also to Mark for inviting me here today to give this presentation to you. Just while I play with the sharing capability on this side of the screen, exactly as Paula has introduced me, so I'm a board member of Women in Mining UK, but of course I still work within the mining sector as well, and so I'm currently up in Yorkshire on what will hopefully at some point in time in the near future become a fantastic mine site. So with regards to this, I've managed to find the right buttons. Hopefully you'll be able to see the screen in front of you at the moment. So I'm going to take the next half an hour just to share some thoughts with all of you on what I mean by the beauty of interconnected natural resource ecosystems. And this all starts with, of course, this wonderful picture that we all know and love. Of course, this is our little planet that is whizzing through space at hundreds of thousands of kilometers per second. And I think this is just truly remarkable. It's absolutely amazing, especially because, of course, many of us are geoscientists. 4.56 billion years ago, this is what our little patch of space looked like. And I was privileged to be able to study some of the material that formed all the way back then for my PhD. So my PhD is all about the composition of those primitive meteorites and those components that formed within our chondritic meteorites or within our chondrites. And of course, it was during this time that we begin to have that young Earth forming. It then gets totally smashed up by a body the size of Mars, so-called Theia, smashing into Earth. But it was at this point in time that, of course, we think that the moon formed. And then, of course, we have this wonderful world of plate tectonics that many of us as geoscientists spend so much of our time imagining and visualizing and thinking, okay, well, if I want to go and find a particular type of rock in the ground or mineral or metal, or if I'm trying to understand why the Earth is doing something, so much of it, of course, comes back to the dynamic nature of plate tectonics. So, of course, we live in this amazingly complicated but fascinating system that encompasses our Earth and is the embodiment of our Earth. But it's not just that natural system that we're looking at. Of course, living on this earth are one or two human beings. Yes, there are now well over 8 billion of us living on this planet. And whenever we're talking about sustainability or survivability, etc., yep, it's about us as humans surviving on our planet. But in a perfect world, we're also thriving on our planet. Now, this is important because, as we know, as we've gone through time, there have been one or two events where rather a lot of the life that has developed on Earth and evolved on Earth has been eradicated. And so these extinction events, of course, from a geological perspective, certainly when we're studying our undergraduate degrees, we spend a lot of time working our way through the geological timescale and saying, okay, look at all these amazing fossils and what do they tell us about the natural climatic conditions of Earth at that point in time? What do we think that story is that those rocks are telling us? And so within this natural world in which we're living, of course, we've got these natural changes that impose themselves on us. But then as human beings as well, we know that we need to go through some transformations as well. And the awesome thing about the time in which we're living is that, yeah, we're getting to go through a pretty phenomenal change at the moment, not just because we know at some point in time we're going to run out of some of those non-renewable forms of energy, but actually if we can go through a change which enables us to use more renewable forms of power generation, if we do this right, then we can actually unlock some of the wealth in the ground beneath our feet for people around the world that perhaps at the moment aren't as wealthy as some of the other patches of the world. And this is what really embodies the just energy transition, which to some of us sounds like a whole load of jargon, but underneath the skin actually contains a whole load of exciting possibility and opportunities that we can leverage. So within all of this, there's perhaps a hypothesis that if humans behave correctly, could we actually increase the carrying capacity of Earth? So much of what we talk about is the fact that actually human beings are destroying nature, or we're destroying our planet, or we're making everything bad. But I'd like to kind of throw in the hypothesis that actually we're not totally stupid here. If we use our imaginations and our creativity to the best of our ability, perhaps we can actually increase that carrying capacity or that potential of our little rock that is flying through space so quickly. And how can we do that? Well, we know that our little planet is, of course, finite in its own space. Now, yes, we can go out to the asteroid belt, we can go to the moon and Mars, etc., as well. And I'd be perfectly happy to speak about that. But let's just focus in on our little planet, where we don't need to escape things like the clutches of gravity. And within our planet, we've got so much value that is either within the ground beneath our feet, or in the plants and the animals, etc., all around us, in the atmosphere, the air that we breathe, etc. So what does this value really look like? And I was lucky enough recently to go and run some workshops with some school students in St Andrews, and then also with the university students. And I asked them to draw a block diagram, which was great to start with, because I could see who can draw in 3D, always a good skill if you're trying to tempt people into the world of minerals and metals and things like that. But I said, okay, if you're visualizing a patch of earth, and let's think of it including all of the rocks and everything up above our heads as well, and I asked you to annotate it and to depict some areas of value. What do you see as being valuable? And if you can see some of what is in this slide, it was pretty awesome, some of what they were drawing. And I'm not going to tell you which diagrams were drawn by the school pupils compared to the university students. But I thought it was really awesome how people were depicting things like mining. You've also got some of them depicting the geothermal fluids. We've got people talking about the soil, as well as all kinds of bits and pieces on the surface. And these were all aspects that those individuals perceived as being valuable in the world round about us. And that's important because, of course, when we're talking about, say, mining, there are two big discussions that tend to be had. And these discussions are either about our primary raw materials, so those materials that we're digging out of the ground for the first time, and they are potentially being turned into metals. And I say not turned into metals, of course, they're processed so we can actually use them as metals in all of the technology and infrastructure around about us. So we might dig that material out of the ground, and then off it goes, ideally into the circular economy. And when that material becomes recycled at some point in time, that's when it turns into that secondary raw material. So you have a lot of people who, when they're talking about the provenance of minerals and metals, they're referring to that particular atom of copper or whatever it might be, and off it goes into the circular economy. But of course, as soon as it's left that patch of land, what happens to that land itself? So there's a second form of value that we need to be thinking about. And that is, how do we visualize, or how do we measure the total value of that package of land from which that copper comes? And when we're talking about these primary raw materials, the secondary raw materials, our language often gets quite confused. I was recently lucky enough to go and spend a little bit of time in Geneva at the United Nations. And what really struck me in a lot of the discussions was people were talking about the circular economy, but then in the second breath, they were talking about, well, the land from which the material came. And there was no real distinction about, well, hang on a second, what's the important thing here? Is it where the copper goes to, what it's used in? Or is it the land that it comes from and the people that perhaps have either benefited or been potentially harmed by that copper being extracted out of the land? What are we talking about here in terms of the value? So what I'd like to do now is, instead of talking about the circular economy and where all the minerals and metals go to, I'd like to really zoom in on, well, the land from which those materials come. Because this is the place where perhaps there's a huge amount of opportunity that we're not necessarily unlocking yet. We're beginning to talk about it, but we're not necessarily unlocking it for a whole host of reasons. So when we zoom in on that patch of land, it's here where we begin to go, hang on a second, it's not just the minerals and the metals that we can extract from it. You never know, there might be some oil and gas or something like that as well. There might be some groundwater that is within that land. On the surface of that land, there might be some plants, there might be some animals and insects. You never know, somebody might have also planted some wind turbines, etc. as well. And there might be some agriculture that's been undertaken as well. And by the way, this picture behind in the background of this slide, so this is where I'm originally from, in the northeast of Scotland. So I grew up on a farm, and I know what it's like to really say, well, actually, how do we nurture our soil? Because if we don't look after the soil, then to be honest, we're not going to be able to grow very good barley. And then it's a travesty because then we don't have any whiskey, which would be an absolute disgrace. So how do we look at this interconnected ecosystem of different forms of value? And it's not just looking at this interconnected ecosystem at one point in time, it's about visualizing it through time as well. And this is something that within the world of exploration and mining, we're quite good at often. And that's because when we're talking about our value chain within the mining world, of course, it is not only long, but we have lots of different actors or lots of different bits that come to play. So, for example, when we're all the way at the beginning in that world of exploration, and we're there going, okay, hang on a second, which commodities do I actually want to look for? Or which patch of the world do I want to go and explore? We've got so many possibilities that we can explore at the beginning within exploration. And then, of course, we start to make decisions and we start to constrain ourselves into, okay, hang on a second, if I'm lucky enough for there to be something that someone else perceives as being valuable in the ground beneath my feet, perhaps now I've got a project. And then if that project manages to come to fruition, now I might actually have a full-blown operation. So what does that look like? And the awesome thing about exploration is really the world is our oyster. We can do whatever we like at that point in time. But as we begin to zoom in on that project, of course, we become much, much, much more focused. But also within that, of course, the nature of the organizations that are involved, they tend to change as well. So any of us who have been to those large exploration conferences, no matter where they might be it in Toronto or wherever, knows that you've got a huge number of people, all of whom promise you that they have the world's most amazing deposits of beautiful metal in the ground beneath their feet. And it's up to you whether you believe them or not. And then, of course, as soon as you get to the point where we're building a project, now you're potentially deploying billions of dollars into building infrastructure with actually not getting any return on that investment for many, many years. So what does this look like? Those organizations tend to look very, very different. And then you have the operator who's not necessarily the developer. So what does that operator really want? What do their values look like? What kind of appetite do they have for risk? That might look very different, especially to the person who is undertaking that exploration all the way at the beginning of that time horizon. And then we think about closure. Well, do they care? They say they care, but do they really? What does that actually look like? And of course, as we progress through time, these can be incredibly long time horizons. Not, of course, on a geological timescale, we're not talking billions of years, but we are talking significant timescales that are certainly longer than any politician's tenure, perhaps in government. But this is something where, of course, the expectations on mining have been changing. So we're almost moving beyond that point of saying it's all about making sure that we close the mine properly. Actually, it's about saying, well, when we are undertaking the extraction of minerals and metals from the ground, what are we providing to that community within the region that we're working, and thinking about that post-mining environment? What are we leaving behind us? Because that mining project is indeed just a project. It will come to an end at some point because we have zero intention of putting the copper back. But what we do want to do is to make sure that where we're taking that material out of the ground, we're benefiting as many people as possible in that surrounding area, if not further beyond as well. And so if we start viewing the mining project as a construction project, and by that I mean all the way through into that post-mining or that closure phase, then that suddenly begins to change our mindset as to what is not just the purpose of mining, but what are we trying to do for that particular region. So at the precise second in time, I'm sitting basically in a fairly old industrial site in Teesside. You're going to work out exactly which project I'm sitting on at this precise second in time. Now, in this part of the UK, in Yorkshire, of course, there's a huge history of mining, be it iron ore mining, coal mining, salt, and then, of course, more recently, things like fertilizers, etc., coming out of the ground. There's a huge variety of different natural resources that have been extracted that have then gone into the history and the legacy and the development of this particular part of the UK. And of course, all of them are temporary because there's only so much of it that we've got in the ground. So this is something where if we view the value of what we're extracting from the ground just in terms of finance, of course, there's a point in time during this project where we have hopefully some quite nice and juicy financial value. But then if we're not careful, it all falls away. And that's when we get, of course, areas falling back into decline and into poverty, etc. But if we begin to manage this a bit more carefully, that's something where, yeah, we might get a drop off, but if we do this properly and we invest that money in the right way, then what's to say we can't have a more positive, developed future? Also, if we start measuring the value of that land, not just in terms of finance, but also in terms of people and planet, so the environmental aspects and the social aspects, are there things that we can do to make sure that we get a net benefit from before we start mining to after we start mining? So what this means is we're not just focused on the money that we might make as we are digging the material out the ground and selling it, which of course takes a huge amount of time even to get to that point. But if we're doing this in a way where we say, hang on a second, I'm actually aiming a long way into the future, am I actually creating a more developed world by extracting these natural resources? Hopefully, yes. And then we go beyond that and we say, okay, it's not just the iron ore that I'm extracting from the ground. What about things like the potash? What else can I extract from the ground beneath my feet? What does this story look like? It looks much more complicated, but it looks much more interesting. And why am I waving my arms around and drawing all these pictures and saying we need to think 200 years into the future? You know, who am I kidding with regards to this? Well, the reason why I'm saying this is that a number of surveys and studies have been done of the mining sector over the last year. And this is a picture of a slide that was shown at the International Council for Mining and Metals Conference back last year. And it was a study that was undertaken by GlobeScan. They went to approximately 30,000 people from across 32 countries and asked them, which sectors do you trust and which sectors don't you trust? Now, those of you who have managed to read to the bottom of the list will now have found where mining is. So mining is less trusted than things like drinking, gambling, tobacco, etc. Now, last time I checked, and I realize that some people might disagree with me here, we don't need those other things. But of course, we do need the metals and the minerals that we dig out of the ground, not just for things like the energy transition, but if we are to survive as human beings, we need the stuff that mining provides, but people don't trust us. And why is that? Well, the hypothesis that I pose to you is it's in part because when we are building our mines, when we are undertaking our mining activity, people feel that we're doing it just for us rather than doing it for everybody round about us. And there's a huge amount of research that's gone into what does trust mean, how do you build trust with different communities, etc. But this is something here where perhaps when we're looking at the value of our minerals and metals and we're looking at how we look after them, perhaps there's been a bit too much focus on where those minerals and metals go into that circular economy, rather than how we respect that land that, of course, doesn't move. It stays exactly where we left it when we extracted that copper from the ground, because trust doesn't really matter with regards to where the copper goes in the circular economy, but it does matter with regards to what happens with regards to the land itself. So in terms of this development and viewing mining as a project, or perhaps that catalyst for development within a society, there are lots of different case studies that we can look at this, many of which where things went wrong, to be honest. And to be honest, people could look at Teesside, they could look at Yorkshire and say, oh, well, look at the disaster that is here at the moment. But let's look at this from a glass half full perspective, rather than where we've got abandoned steel mills and stuff like that. And I'm actually going to take you on a little case study or a little field trip to Brazil. And I'm sure some of you have been to the place that I'm about to talk about. So back in 2010, I was incredibly lucky to go and work on a site in Brazil. From a geological perspective, I was lucky because this was a carbonatite. And of course, as we know, carbonatites have the most glorious rocks. They are so exciting and very interesting. They can be incredibly complicated, but that's what makes them really cool to look at. So I went and spent some time in this place called Catalão in Brazil. And if we go back in time, this patch of land, so here I have my cube of land, and I'm going to overly simplify Catalão. So if we go back in time, so this is a very nice part of the world. There's some rivers, and then there's a beautiful natural environment, one or two snakes, some toucans flying through the air with their beautiful beaks. And of course, there are some farmers as well. So this is how the local people would perhaps look after themselves, etc. And then one day, someone goes, hang on a second, I think there might be some juicy rocks in the ground beneath my feet. And of course, what do we find within this carbonatite complex? We find some niobium and we find some phosphates. There's a whole load of other stuff, but I'll come on to that in a second. And so during this particular phase, we go, okay, hang on a second. Yeah, we think it might be an idea to dig some of this out of the ground. So the decision is made to start the mining activity. And so we have some more people moving into the area, which is exciting. So Catalão as a town begins to grow. And then we go, well, actually, especially with regards to our phosphate, we kind of need some form of infrastructure to be able to get this out to market. So teaming up with some of the other mining companies in the area, we might build a railway line, for example. But then what this means is it's opening up that area a little bit more. So there are more people coming into the area, and not just because now we've got some juicy phosphate, which means that we can grow better crops. Perhaps there's a little bit more farming activity as well. Then as time progresses a little bit further, of course, our hole in the ground gets deeper, but also the broader society gets a little bit more developed as well. And so this is something where we're in the heartland of Brazil. We have fantastic farmland. And so John Deere, the tractor company, decides, I know, we're going to build a tractor factory in the town of Catalão. And then Mitsubishi rock up and they say, oh, and everybody needs cars as well. We're going to build lots of Mitsubishi cars. So they open a car factory. And this is fantastic because we're mining away and we've got lots of people now in the community, lots of very skilled labor, which is brilliant. But of course, we begin to run out of that phosphate and niobium. So we need to go into the beginnings of that closure phase within that mine. So what kind of rehabilitation, obviously, have we been doing all the way through? But we need to make sure that mine is closed in a responsible manner. Now, just because the mine is closing doesn't mean to say that the tractor factory or the car factory needs to shut down. No, in fact, what it means is this is great because there is somewhere for some of those mine workers to go and get different jobs if they want to stay in the region. Of course, we're talking about Brazil here, so there are plenty other mining opportunities if they want them. And then, of course, we now go into the future. This mine, of course, is still open, the one that I'm talking about. But at some point in time in the future, of course, they will say, actually, there's no more phosphate or niobium left in the ground. So we now need to go into that full closure phase. But what could we do with our infrastructure? Well, actually, maybe we turn the plant into a recycling plant. I don't know. I'm not a metallurgist, as you can probably tell. But what are we doing within that natural environment or in that society that we have now been a key part of helping to develop? So in this little case study that is very much oversimplified, if we look at this through time with those little cube diagrams, if we're being really honest with ourselves, did we as the mining company ever plan any of this in advance? Of course we didn't. It just kind of happened because we were too busy focusing on how do we make sure that our production is safe, and our production is optimized and as efficient, etc., as possible? And how do we make sure that the types of fertilizer that we're selling are what the market actually wants, etc.? That's what we've been focused on. We haven't been focused on the development of that particular patch of land. But if we said, well, hang on a second, can I try and portray the value that the sheer act of mining or unlocking those natural resources brought to this community? Well, I can begin to do this with a little bit of a stacked or a waterfall diagram and say, okay, if we go back to the beginning in terms of when we just had that farming, a little bit of forestry, the natural environment, and people living there, so being farmers, all the way back at the beginning. So this is what we might say that the value of that land could look like. And then, of course, we start doing our exploration, and that adds value to the land because we now know more about it. So just by collecting that data and beginning to understand that data, that says, oh my goodness me, look at this amazing biodiversity that we've got here. Look at the potential of the rocks in the ground beneath our feet. What does all of this actually look like? And then we can carry on through time, and we can begin to build all of this up. So we've now got the infrastructure coming in. We now begin to extract our niobium and our phosphate. Perhaps we use some of the overburden as aggregates, depending on, of course, what the composition is. And all of this carries on through time. We've got our tractor factory coming in here. And of course, being a carbonatite, it's not just the phosphate and niobium that we're thinking about. There might be some rare earth elements. There might be some copper at depth, who knows, in terms of what we might be able to have here. So all of this through time allows us to increase the value, provided, of course, we're recognizing it and we're bringing it all together. Who knows, we might have some carbon capture we can bring into this as well. And then, of course, the shifts at the end of the life of mine. So now we've extracted all of the minerals and metals that we find useful at that point in time. What are we going to do with that land later? So we need to be thinking about that as well. So this is how we might be able to construct it through time and begin to really work out some of those value-based models. But also as well, we need to be thinking about, well, who are the different companies or organizations that we need to come to the table? Is it the mining company's responsibility to pull all these people to the table? Or should it be the government that's there thinking, well, hang on a second, what's my development plan for this region? What does this actually look like? And this is kind of the awesome bit, because if the government truly recognises the potential that those natural resources can give to that community if they are used in the most appropriate way, that can be the seed funding that is needed to instigate things like that tractor factory and that car factory. And all of this requires us to think over huge timescales compared to what we currently do. So all of this, of course, requires some form of measurement. And how on earth do we begin to measure this? Well, of course, in the world of minerals and metals, etc., we have things like the Crisco codes. And they're, of course, been going through lots of evolution over the last while, which is great. Then when we step into the world of oil and gas, of course, there are very well-regarded codes there as well in terms of the resources and reserves. And then we have the same kind of thing either in place or being developed for things like groundwater, carbon sequestration, and then the storage of hazardous materials underground. All of these different areas have their own ways and forms of governance in terms of reporting on and calculating, well, what is the value of that piece of land? What can I actually do with it? And then we have the same thing above the surface as well. So when you go into the world of agriculture and natural capital, etc., there's a whole delight in terms of the world of different standards and expectations that are out there as well, all of which require slightly different arrays of data collection, etc., that we need to be able to pull together and say, okay, well, how do I understand all of this as an interconnected whole for that single patch of land? If I'm not careful, I could just get really bogged down in trying to understand just one little bit of it rather than all of it. Now, this is where I might get a bit controversial because I'm going to put UNFC up on the board. And this is something where the United Nations Framework Classification for Resources, of course, has been around for really quite a long time now. It theoretically should be able to provide a framework through which we can pull together different forms of value and compare and contrast them using the mechanisms that have been designed there. For those of you who haven't come across UNFC, I'm about to destroy it by drawing it slightly differently, so bear with me on this. Basically, what this framework does is it says, what do we have with regards to the technical aspects of that natural resource, no matter what it might be? And then on the next axis, we have, okay, from a sustainability perspective, what does it mean with regards to, say, the environmental aspects, the social aspects, and the economic aspects? So sustainability generally consists of three component parts: the environment, social, and economics. Those are the three parts that come together to form sustainability. Note, that is not the same as ESG, which is environment, social, and governance. But sustainability, if we go back to the 1980s, when people were first formally defining it, consists of the environment, the social, and the economic parts. So we've got on one axis our technical feasibility. On our other axis, we've got sustainability. And then on our third axis, just because we can, we have that degree of confidence or uncertainty. Now, despite the fact that I'm originally a geologist, I now spend most of my time as a risk manager working with lots of different organisations, helping them to deal with uncertainty and how it might impact on their objectives. So this concept of bringing in uncertainty here doesn't really faze a risk manager at all. And of course, it doesn't really faze a geologist either. But what we can begin to do here is, if we've got our technical aspect and we've got our sustainability aspect, and then we can bring in how confident are we that that thing might be true, we can begin to build ourselves, again, the most complicated diagram in the world, but allows us to colour in boxes and perhaps say, okay, well, from a copper perspective, I think we might have something here. From a groundwater perspective, we might have something else. From a carbon sequestration perspective, from our ability to plant trees and what they might give us, what does it look like as well? So theoretically, UNFC should be able to bring all of these aspects together, not really for a single asset, so for a single mine, but actually for a slightly broader region. What are all those different aspects of value that could be brought together, which you can then say, okay, in what order do we actually want to be able to extract or to utilize that value? So we can then begin to build that Gantt chart once we understand what is in the ground, what is in the surface, what has value for us as well. So going back to this original diagram, a lot of people, when they're talking about the value of minerals and metals, now in that world of energy transition, circular economy, spend a huge amount of time focusing in on how do we keep that copper in circulation, which is great. And that is pertaining to the circular economy aspect, and that's really important. But we need to remember that all of these minerals and metals have come from somewhere. They've come from a patch of land, and it's that patch of land in which that trust is embodied that we really, really need in order to be able to get that social license to operate and maintain it, if we are to continue mining those minerals and metals from out of the ground. We get that trust by understanding and respecting what is in the ground beneath our feet, and then perhaps working with society, with those local people, to say, okay, this isn't just about extracting the copper, it's also about making sure we unlock and leverage all those other forms of value that we might be able to leverage from that patch of ground. So in conclusion, as we know, we only have one planet Earth. We haven't yet found another one, although of course the search will continue. Natural resources rarely occur in isolation, despite the fact that most of our models, etc., are really focused in on one, maybe two minerals or metals that are in there. Also, our tax systems, etc., reward us for keeping things simple rather than looking for that interconnectivity. We don't tend to view our land over long time scales, unless, of course, you go and speak to traditional landowners or First Nations, etc. Well, they will talk about 7 generations. So they are already talking about, well, hang on a second, what will my grandchild's grandchild's grandchild, etc., what will they find on this land when we finish doing what we need to do with it now? When we're talking about value, we can be looking at both the technical aspects, but also we need to be thinking about the sustainability aspects as well. So we need to broaden that thinking in terms of how we value what we're looking at. And then finally as well, if we apply our brains, what other opportunities can we unlock from the patches of land that we've got here on Earth? Because we've only got one tiny little planet. And at the moment, we're not really using it, perhaps, to the best of our abilities. So how can we make sure that we don't just survive on our planet, we also thrive on our planet? So with that, I shall go to my last slide and open for any questions. Thank you very much.